So, welcome to Spiritually Speaking. Today, I've got a special guest. Nick Duggan is going to join us today for the podcast. Nick has been developing people and organizations over the last 20 years, and he's passionate about making work more meaningful for all. He is the founder of Deeper Work, a coaching and training firm offering leadership development programs for people-focused leaders and purpose-driven companies. Nick is an ICF-trained executive coach. He specializes in helping leaders increase their impact and grow their careers. Nick puts a special focus on cultivating deeper meaning at work. He loves growing and supporting innovative and inclusive teams. And then over the course of his career, he's built and led both learning and development as well as DEI operations. Nick is a gay man, a proud member of the LGBTQ community who loves and cares deeply about diversity, equity, and inclusion. He is committed to being an active ally and advocate for people from all marginalized and underrepresented communities. Welcome to the podcast, Nick.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be here.
It's great to have. Nick and I go back. We did a podcast together back in, 2022?
That sounds right. Yep.
I think it was. I was on his podcast and I enjoyed it so much. We were talking about workplace spirituality, and I'm so grateful that he has agreed to join me here today on this podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, Nick, absolutely. Can you start by introducing yourself? Just give us a little bit of background beyond what I had described, a little bit about the work that you do.
Yeah, you covered a lot of the basics. Thanks for that great introduction. As you mentioned, most of my work has been in leading employee-facing functions in tech companies, L&D, DEI, employee communications. I'm a certified coach. I did my master's degree in organizational psychology, and my thesis was focused on workplace spirituality. So I think that was one of the areas that led me to you to begin with in terms of our shared passion around that area. Yeah, and I would say spirituality has been a part of my life and my work for quite a while. And it's an interesting subject because it's not something that gets talked a lot about in the workplace. And so for me, it's been a journey of, having my own personal path and the role that spirituality has played in my own life and my own career development. And then also finding, how do I want to, what are the appropriate ways to incorporate what we call spirituality into a corporate environment? That's really been one of the questions that has shaped my career. As you mentioned, diversity, equity, and inclusion are also very important to me. As someone who grew up gay and in the closet, I certainly experienced some of that marginalization as part of that community. I'm also a white cisgender man, so I recognize I have a certain level of unearned power and privilege, and have done my best to try and dedicate the power and privilege I do have to supporting those from underrepresented and marginalized communities, as you mentioned. Yeah, that's a bit about me, and really looking forward to this conversation today.
Yes, we've got so much synergy, so much alignment between what we're passionate about. So this is going to be good. I know it is. So you and I talked a little bit about spiritual intelligence, and I described to you what I have put together as a result of my work and this model that I have, this 4-factor model that I have of spiritual intelligence. But first of all, tell me, what does the concept of spiritual intelligence mean to you personally?
Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think one of the things that I certainly find in my work is that spirituality or spiritual intelligence or any words related to that means so many different things to so many people. And I think that's one of the challenges in talking about this work, is finding ways to talk about it in ways that don't activate people's trigger responses. There certainly has been a lot of conversation around religion and spirituality in the past that has not been helpful. And so I think finding the terms to talk about it in inclusive and appropriate ways in a work context is really important. And I love the term that you focus on in terms of spiritual intelligence, because I think that people are familiar with the concept, for example, of emotional intelligence, and have gotten comfortable with it. And so talking about spiritual intelligence, I think, is a really nice way of bringing that concept in a way that people understand the relevance of it to a professional context. For me, I go to the definition of spirituality itself. And I always say that for me, my definition of spirituality is whatever is most deeply important to you. Whether you use the word spirituality or soul or not, it's really about getting in touch with that deeper part of you and your deeper connection to everything and everyone around you. And so spiritual intelligence to me is about your ability to bring your own spirituality, however you define it, into your life and work in a practical and tangible way.
Yes. So, excellent definition of spirituality. You mentioned the fact that people often conflate religiosity with spirituality. And while you and I both know that it would be difficult, but not impossible, to call yourself religious and not have any spirituality, but you certainly completely can have spirituality without religion. And so a
Absolutely.
lot of people don't really fully understand that. As we talk about this concept of spiritual intelligence, I conceptualize it as a four-factor model. The first factor being critical existential thinking, our ability to think about reality and the nature of existence, about life, about death, about God, in ways that are critically thought out, using reason and logic and coming to well-reasoned conclusions about these types of things is really important. So that's critical existential thinking. Inner peace expansion is really about finding and sustaining, maintaining the harmony between various parts of ourselves and in our relationships with others. Inner peace is the highest attribute of spirituality if we go back and look at ancient spiritual philosophy. Unity consciousness. And this is really important, I think, in the work context. It's really important in society in general to be able to think and act in ways that unite ourselves with other people. Well, some of us have been so hardwired and programmed to only seeing the differences. It's like we got to reprogram ourselves to understand the underlying unifying factors of consciousness. And then lastly, personal meaning production, which is right up your alley. And it's our ability to derive greater meaning, not only in the work that we do, but I would say at the place we work. So Nick, how does this model relate to your own experience, your experience personally, your experience with corporations, your experience in coaching individuals?
Yeah. I mean, it's a very comprehensive model. So I think it shows up in a lot of different ways. And I appreciate it because it gives words sometimes to things that are hard, right? A lot of factors of spirituality, I've heard it said that many spiritual texts or scriptures or even concepts point to something beyond words, right? Because the experience of spirituality is by definition beyond explanation in words. And so being able to find the words to describe these concepts is really challenging. And I think you've done a nice job of that here. I think on a personal level, spirituality has been really important to my own development. And I think these concepts that you've articulated resonate with me on a personal level. I think one of the things that has been true for me, if you think about, for me, it really starts with the meaning, right? Because I think my personal journey has been very focused for the last 20 years on how do I find a deeper sense of meaning, and starting with trying to find that externally, right? Like, what is the job that I need that will give me meaning? What is the workplace that I need to be at that will provide meaning? And part of my own journey, which I'm sure I could go on for hours about, has been the journey towards realizing that meaning actually starts within, right? And that's what pointed me away from business books initially to realizing that I needed to do some inner work and listening to myself and finding spiritual practices to really understand, where do I get a sense of meaning? Because it is beyond the purpose of a particular company or the values of a particular organization. And so that personal meaning production and everything that comes along with that is very relevant to me. I think along the way, as I delved deeper into that work, certainly experienced the power of that inner peace expansion, right? Being able to work through some of the challenges I had faced, finding practices like meditation or being in nature or tapping into intuition that helped me become more centered and grounded in myself. And then the flip side of that is the unity consciousness, right? I think that's one of the amazing paradoxes of my experience of spirituality and what I've heard from others is that it's both about connecting with your true self, and at the same time realizing that we're all connected. We're all part of one. And so that unity consciousness, I think, is really important. And in terms of the critical existential thinking, I think for me, the way that has shown up is really an interest in comparative religion, understanding other spiritual paths, how other people come to it, and then being able to put that all together and decide what is true for me, but also keep my mind open to how others think about it and find those areas of commonality. So I think that's how it's shown up for me personally. In the coaching world, I think when I started out coaching, I was doing much more explicitly personal coaching and had more of a spiritual component to it. I was working with individuals who I primarily met through a spiritual center that I was part of. And so we incorporated a lot of spiritual practice and spiritual language into coaching. Now I primarily focus on leadership and career coaching with professional leaders. And so spirituality is still a part of what I do. In fact, it's one of the things I use in my introduction to say, look, I'll adapt to you, but these are the things that I care about. These are some of the practices that I bring. Here's what it might look like. It's much more about feeling out the right when a practice like a guided meditation or a guided visioning might be helpful, when to support a client in tapping into their intuition or exploring their deeper beliefs, and where they may want something a bit more practical or analytical. So it really is all of the above. And I think from a corporate perspective, that really has been a big part of my journey of figuring out how do these components show up in a workplace environment? And can we use the same terms? Do we need to explain them differently? How do we make sure that they're both inclusive? So people that have different perspectives on spirituality, some who may be religious, some who may be, as you mentioned, spiritual, but not religious, and others who identify as atheist or agnostic or who are really turned off by the concept of religion and spirituality in a professional context. And so for me, it's really been the journey of understanding, even from an academic or a mental perspective, understanding what these concepts are, being able to flex enough that I can use different language in different situations to help people understand them without turning them off based on their initial impression to a concept. Certainly all of these show up both at the individual and organizational level, but I think how I talk about them in the corporate space certainly differs from how I talk about them with someone I know is interested in spirituality already.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's the translation, first and foremost, from the philosophical perspective to psychology. I look at spiritual intelligence through the lens of psychology when I'm talking to organizations, but then even going a step further and trying to relate spiritual concepts to organizational values or principles. And one of the things that I truly believe, and that is that spiritual principles are never in conflict. So it really doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or a Catholic, right? A spiritual principle is a spiritual principle, irregardless to how I feel, what I think, what my worldview is. It's true universally. For me, it's easy for me to articulate that in this setting, but to do that in a corporate environment with people with different views and different experiences, it is challenging, no doubt.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Nick, which of those factors that we just talked about do you identify with most, and why?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because I think it's helpful to separate them out, but I also think they play well together and overlap. I think, in particular, the inner peace and the unity consciousness at depth, right? When you're really in the experience of it, those kind of are different sides of the same coin. But I would say for me, after you explained the model to me, the one that has resonated the most is unity consciousness. And I think that is true for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's a common descriptor. I've been reading quite a bit lately on the neuroscience of spirituality and religion. There's a book called Neurotheology by Andrew Newberg that really explores the role that different areas and components of the brain play in what we call spirituality and religion. And when they research what people describe as mystical experiences or deep spiritual experiences, that sense of unity consciousness, of having the personal boundaries erased and feeling, for lack of a better term, one with everything, is a very common descriptor of people who've had experiences like that. And I think, no, I certainly wouldn't describe myself as enlightened or any of the characters you hear in these grand mystical epics. But I do think part of my journey has been tapping into that really indescribable sense of oneness, right? Not every moment of every day, but when I've been able to tap into it and over time, I get glimpses of that. And I think unity consciousness describes that way. And I think it's one of the challenges that I have in talking about workplace spirituality or spiritual intelligence is it so meaningful to me. It is hard to express in words, right? Especially if someone hasn't necessarily had the same experience. And so something like unity consciousness, I think, is helpful at pointing to this is magical in a way. It really goes beyond the understanding we have of mundane experience. So I like that it's a helpful concept to explain something that is really vast. One of the tidbits that I sometimes use to explain spirituality and how it shows up in all kinds of different ways for different people is that there's a study from Pew Research. They do the state of religion in America every few years. And one of the things they ask about, a lot of things, they ask about identity and religious identity and how often you go to church and how often you pray and do you believe in God? And they break all those down into data points. One of the questions they ask is, how frequently do you feel a sense of awe and wonder about the universe? And I love that question, both because I think it gets to this concept of unity consciousness that's beyond now whether you go to church or believe in a particular God or not. But the other reason that I like it is it's the only factor on the survey that they do that is consistently high among pretty much every self-described group. So people who are religious, people who are spiritual but not religious, people who are agnostic or atheist, all of them have around the same levels of pretty significantly high levels of feeling a sense of wonder and awe about the universe. Some more regularly than others, but on 80 or 90% have those moments at least once a year. Many people have them more than that. But to me, that's an example of what we're talking about when we talk about spirituality without any of the hangups that people have about the word, right? We're talking about that feeling of awe and wonder that you get when you look at a sunset or you feel a connection with nature or you see a new baby or a new pet and you just feel that overwhelming experience of connection that can't explain, right? And the fact that transcends boundaries of social identity, of religious identity, means a lot to me. And so I think that's why this shows up. I think the other place this shows up is, because diversity, equity, and inclusion are important to me. Inclusion is about connectedness, right? And you can't be inclusive by yourself, locked away in your tower. And so that unity consciousness, to me, it means connection with everyone and everything, right? So it means being connected to the planet and nature. It means being connected to higher reality, whatever that means. But it also means being connected to our fellow people and individuals. That can happen at a mystical kind of spiritual level, but it can also happen at a very practical level. And that's the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, is really understanding each other more deeply and hopefully healing some of those aspects of separation. And beyond that, I think as you learn about different cultures, we in the West, Eurocentric kind of history, have a strong history of individualism, right? And many other cultures have a much stronger history of collectivism and the power of collective good, and things like the concept of Ubuntu from Africa, which is I am because we are, right? We without each other, we are nothing. And these are a lot of reasons why I like the unity consciousness one, but I think that collective factor and the connection beyond our differences, unity and diversity, those are all the reasons I think that one resonates with me so strongly.
Yeah, and in these times that we live, unity consciousness is a sorely needed concept. It is a sorely needed factor. I tell people all the time that, if I go to the hospital and I have to have an operation and I need a blood transfusion, they don't sort the blood out, Chinese blood over here, white blood over there, black blood. We all have the same physical blood running through our veins. This unifying factor gets overlooked. There's so many things in our consciousness and in the physical world that unite us. There's far more and stronger ties that bind us together than these things that we allow, to tear us apart. We see this path that we are on in the United States, where we're becoming the divided states. And if we all had more vested in understanding this particular spiritual factor, I think our society would be so much better off.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I'll share another example. As you were speaking, I was reminded I had jury duty a couple of weeks ago, and I was selected to be on the jury. And as I was participating in the process, certainly there are plenty of issues with our justice system, right? There is systemic racism, as in most systems. There are factors, I think, that lead to injustice, unfortunately. But being part of the jury system, it's one of the few, if any, areas where you are truly selected at random, right? So you're put together with fellow citizens and neighbors in ways that are normally clique-based communities are not, right? And so you're collected with this room of very different people. And the idea that by having a truly random group of individuals pulled together to judge the facts, there's something, and there are plenty of problems with our government. I'm not someone who typically is go hooray every part of the Constitution. But this model of a group of citizens coming together and being trusted to, with this responsibility of determining the facts of a situation to ensure justice for anyone, because anyone has a right to a fair trial, was really compelling, right? And noticing the relationships that developed from these 12 jurors and two alternates, even though we're completely random, selected completely at random, have nothing in common other than that we live in the same place. Relationships developed, right? And conversations emerged. And in this context, it's in the service of something that was really important, right? It was a really interesting example of, as divided as we think we are, and in many cases are, there is an underlying unity. And it was a strange place to realize that, because I wouldn't describe jury duty as a particularly spiritual experience, but I really appreciated that coming together of such different perspectives and individuals.
It's amazing you use that example, because the exact same thing happened to me about 3 months ago. It was like the pool was like the United Nations. And none of us had anything in common before we were brought together in this room. But by the end of it, there was just such a sense of togetherness and connectedness. There was a level of understanding and empathy that we had for each other, despite our glaring differences. This idea of the jury pool is, it may have some research value.
Yeah.
I may even look into that at some point.
Healing the world through jury duty.
Yes. So, Nick, specifically, let's talk a little bit about critical existential thinking, right? Do you see critical existential thinking playing a role in the pursuit of meaningful and purposeful work? Or how do you see that? If you do, how do you see that being a factor that's related to meaningful work?
Yeah, I do see. I think some of these things, one of the challenges is that all of these are deeply personal aspects of our lives, right? And some of them we share and experience with others, whether it's with friends or in a spiritual community or in a work community, or for me in coaching relationships. We do talk a lot about deep things because there's a confidentiality consideration, and people often share more than they will in a different context. And some of this stuff is just impossible to talk about. You experience it on your own without being able to articulate it. So, I think about my own experience, and certainly being able to reflect on and think about, what do I believe, and how does that relate to other things that I believe, and does it make sense, and what does it look like in practice, I think has been very crucial. And I like that you call it out, because it is a marriage of meaning and logic, right? And one of the things I often talk about is I think we've let those parts of ourselves separate, right? And Western Eurocentric culture has become over-reliant on the logical, rational brain, which is not good at looking at collective good or the holistic picture. But when you talk about critical existential thinking, it goes beyond what we might call blind faith, right? Or believing in something. It's about thinking critically about what do I believe and what are certainly taking into account things we don't typically think of as logical or rational, like mystical or spiritual experiences, but then putting them all together in a framework that makes sense to us. While I think, as with all critical thinking, being open to other perspectives, right? I think that's been part of it for me is like, how do I ground myself in what I've come to understand is true for me while always leaving the door open to, I could be wrong. There may be new evidence. People may understand things a different way. So that's always been important to me. One of the things I often share when I talk about my own spiritual journey to figure out who am I and what matters to me is early when I started explicitly focusing on spirituality in my mid-20s, I was reading a lot, right? I was reading spiritual books and self-help books. And for a period of a couple years, it felt like every book I read was telling me the opposite thing. And so I read a lot, and I was very attracted to books around things, what we might call the law of attraction, right? Or the power of positive thinking. And I still believe in that. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how that works. But that idea that we are valuable beings and that we deserve good things and that focusing on positive energy can help us feel a deeper sense of joy. I don't think it's as much about getting the big house or attracting the right stuff, although I think that is valid, but it's more about that sense of self-worth and value and ability to feel a deep joy and connection. And I would feel really good. And I'd read that book and I'd feel amazing. And then I'd read another book, perhaps from a Taoist or Buddhist tradition that was about non-attachment and letting go of both the joys and the sadness and life is suffering or the power of now, like just being in the moment and not letting anything affect you. And that felt really good and made sense. But then I try to put them together and it's like, how can I both be, attracting great things and also letting go of everything? And it was this like ping pong match in my head. And after a while, I don't even know if I could explain it, but it have all settled together in myself, right? Which there is something beyond these concepts, right? We talk about, Buddhism in particular talks about duality, right? And are you thinking about this in a dualistic frame of mind, which is the day-to-day reality we all live in? Or are you looking at the more united picture of ultimate reality in which there is no division? And finding a way to put these two things together of non-attachment, but also allowing myself to feel joy and gratitude. And I had to find that for myself, right? But it was a mix of experience and reading and critical thinking, right? It was thinking about, gosh, how do these concepts fit together? And again, like I said, I'm not sure I could even do a good job of articulating where I landed, but it feels right for me. And so I think
Sure.
that that process was really important in my own personal development. Now, I will say, I probably, that's a conversation I probably have the least with others, because in the corporate space, an individual's beliefs are one of the most sacrosanct things that we don't really rate. A lot of times, even when I'm doing DEI work or talking about workplace spirituality, I start with, look, you are entitled to your own beliefs, right? And my role is not to change your beliefs. It's to provide information and provide conversation and the space for reflection. And so I think that process often happens internally, or you talk about it with friends rather than showing up in the work that I do. But I do think it's a very critical and important component.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. So, how, let's talk a little bit about inner peace, right? Because from the ancient perspective, inner peace is the highest of all of the spiritual qualities that we have access to. And I'm just curious if you have any examples of people who either have the ability or the inability to find and maintain that inner peace within their self. Because we all know that our relationships with others is impacted by our ability to find inner peace and to be at peace, and maybe how that's all related to the workplace.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an important question. I think one of the things that I have come to learn for myself, I think I saw inner peace as the end goal for a long time, similar to enlightenment, right? You read these stories about how a hero or a character or a religious figure has gone through the road of trials and achieved a lasting state of enlightenment or a lasting state of inner peace. And I always felt bad about myself that I couldn't get there, that was what my ultimate goal was. And I think over the years, what I've realized is it's not a perfect state of inner peace. As human beings, I don't think that's possible. Personally, maybe there's a few outstanding people who are able to spend more of their time in that, but I think for the majority of us, it's the ability to tap into it when we can, and having it as a tool in our toolkit. I mean, I think I have developed a decent ability to find that inner peace, and I'm not there all the time. I get stressed out and I have to go to my counselor and I worry about things and I get upset. I think people sometimes hold the bar too high on what inner peace is, and so they don't pursue it. And to me, you can have inner peace in a moment, right? A lot of what I did during the pandemic at work was offering short, mindful meditation experiences. And I still do that. And part of what I really try to underline is it doesn't take very much, right? And so I'll intentionally do a practice that's 30 seconds, right? I'll have people count their breaths, or I'll have them pay attention to their senses for 30 seconds or a minute. And then I'll ask, how did that feel? Right. And also, it's relaxing. It feels nice. And of course, you can do more. It's always beneficial, but you can get a lot towards inner peace just from a moment. Right. And so realizing that it's not this unreachable goal on a mountaintop that you have to climb Mount Everest to claim, and only, you know, Jesus and Buddha and Lao Tzu and these amazing historical figures have ever achieved it. It's something that you can cultivate and make deeper and deeper. So I think that's one thing that's important. I think certainly we've been seeing a lot of kind of lack of self-care, burnout epidemic that I think was sparked by the pandemic, but is continuing, where people don't value for themselves the importance of disconnecting and prioritizing, tapping into that sense of inner peace. And so I think it's certainly something that's very, very relevant right now. And I see it a lot with my coaching clients, right? Because I think that's an environment where they are more open with what they're actually experiencing in terms of their stress and their concerns. And, you know, every person's different, but we often work on practices that help them find their inner sense of balance. And a part of coaching is not telling people what to do, but helping them find their own way to it. And then observing that, you know, people have their own different paths to inner peace. For some people, it's being still and meditating and letting go of their thoughts. For others, it's being active, exercising, being in nature. It's drawing. It's a more visual practice. Everyone has their own way. You know, peace does not mean stillness or not thinking, right? A lot of times when I teach meditation, people think that you have to stop thinking, and that's impossible. So I think that's what I try to reinforce is find your own definition of inner peace. And you can find just because it's just a moment doesn't mean that's not it. You can find it and then just keep expanding on it and moving it deeper. There's no there to get to every little bit that you can do. I think the important thing is the commitment to stepping away from the stress and the busyness and taking, whether it's a minute or an hour or a daily practice, whatever it is, it's that discipline of stepping away and saying, this is important for me to develop and affects how I show up in my life and at work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. One of the ways that I like to characterize inner peace and how I find it in the moment is like a moment of silence. It can be as simple as just, and I'm not talking about silencing everything around me, but turning off the noise in my head. And being able to do that, but you I have to practice that to develop the ability to even do that for a moment. But if I do that for 2 or 3 minutes, the value is tremendous. One of the things about inner peace that I have found, particularly when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and being marginalized, when you're in a battle in the workplace because someone has marginalized you or done something that is unjust or something that conflicts with the principles of unity, and you are in and of yourself in conflict and in angst and emotional pain. I can recall incidents where that has happened to me in major situations. And in one instant, I was not able to find any peace. And what I did was I quit. I just walked away. Now, I believe that everything happens for a reason, and that no matter what happens, if I do the right thing, things will follow. I totally believe that. But in that moment, I couldn't do it. And then that happened to me again in another context. And this time, I took the time to find the inner peace. And when I found the inner peace, I was able to use my logic, my intellect, my intuition to make arguments and to challenge the assumptions that were being leveled at me. I felt that I felt were unjust, and I was successful, right? Because I was able to be at peace enough to reason through and to logically lay out my defense and my position in ways that aligned with spiritual principles, and the powers that be saw that as being an argument that won the day. And inner peace has a lot of implications. It has implications on our ability to reason. It also, a lack of inner peace, and I like to look at that as negative energy, has both mental and physical implications, right? The extent to which I have anguish, worry, doubt, fear, I create conditions necessary for illness to take place, either mental illness or physical illness, or both. But when I am resonating and expressing and holding positive energy in my spirit, light, it's more like a healing process. It's more like life giving instead of life depleting. So inner peace is, to me, is a gigantic principle. And I think the ancients really did have it right when they said it's the highest, the highest value spiritual attribute.
It is. I love what you shared there. The only thing that I would add is I think because I see people doing this, you're not doing anything wrong and nothing is wrong with you if you can't access that inner sense of peace at a particular moment, right? When you had the experience of you had to walk away from that job, that was what you needed to do in that moment and nothing was wrong with you. You didn't do anything wrong by not being able to access that inner peace, right?
Yep.
And I think that's what I've described as like the Mount Everest approach, right? Is that people are already having a tough time, are already beating themselves up, and then they beat themselves up because they can't feel any peace. That's not going to help you get to where you want to be. So one of the things I often tell people is, first of all, you don't have to do this alone, right? That's part of the idea of unity consciousness is there are people who can help you, whether it's friends, family, professional, mental help, or spiritual help. And if you can't immediately tap into inner peace or you're not sure where to start, I think trying to cultivate presence is a good way to start, right? And that is, I think, something that has been taught by the ancients as well, is just being, the Buddha said, life is suffering, right? Nothing is ever going to be perfect. And being able to just be present. This helped me a week ago when I was feeling stressed out and I was trying to calm down and think positively and all the tools. And what I finally realized was like, I just need to accept that this is where I am. This is what's happening right now. And that's hard enough, but just to be like, I'm sitting here in my room. This is what's happening with my business or my career. These are the thoughts that I'm having. And it doesn't stop the thoughts, but being able to focus like, this is where I am now. Can I just pay attention to what's happening is a good start, right? Even if you're not feeling peaceful about it, even if you're just noticing how you're feeling about it, is a good place to start. Don't beat yourself up if you don't immediately feel inner peace, I guess. It's my main advice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Nick, let's bring this all the way back to where we started. And I want to wrap this up with a conversation more specifically about meaning and purpose, both in and at work. So you work with a lot of leaders. I've published a ton of research on leadership, and I've also been a leader, at various levels throughout an organizational context. But how do you see leaders creating conditions? Because I think the leader creates the condition, the environment where people either can or cannot derive meaning and purpose in the work that they do and or at the place that they work. What are some of the things that leaders can do to create this condition or this environment where people can derive greater meaning and purpose?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's interesting because I think one of the things that I learned when I was studying workplace spirituality for my master's thesis was that a lot of the things that leaders can do well is the things that we already think of as good leadership, creating space for people to be themselves, to take a coaching approach, to have a clear vision. But as I've thought about this, there are things I think that are particularly helpful in helping people to cultivate deeper meaning and purpose at work. The first one is self-awareness. A leader cannot help others create meaning and purpose if they've not done that themselves. And I
Mm.
think that's one of the drawbacks of a lot of existing approaches to meaning at work is it starts with company purpose and company values and helping individuals connect to that. And there's good research about how that works, right? And some companies, I always say you have to start where people in a company are ready to. And if that's the door they want to open first, great. But to me, you have to provide that opportunity for leaders, or you, as a leader, you have to take the opportunity to think about your own, what is meaningful to me and what do I really care about? What is my sense of purpose and the impact that I want to have in the world? What are my purpose? What are my values and how do those relate to the values of my organization? So I think that's number one. The second is really creating the time for reflection, both as a leader for yourself, because it takes time to reflect, to come to that consideration. But if you're creating space for others, you have to give them the opportunity to think about it. One of the things that I found most powerful and yet also perplexing is that I will often do a 5-minute exercise to help people in the midst of another workshop, right, about personal impact or career growth or something else that has them reflect on a meaningful experience and then do like a brief, ask yourself why, and then ask yourself why again, and get to the root of what's meaningful for them. And it ends with a single word that's, usually something like connection or love or community or joy. And it's very simple, right? And then I move on and talk about other parts of the content. But almost inevitably, when I do that, someone will come up to me afterwards and be like, that was so meaningful. It was so powerful because I haven't taken the time or had the time to think about what was meaningful to me or important to me in such a long time. And it took 5 minutes, right? Now you can't certainly get totally connected to your own sense of meaning in 5 minutes, but the fact that just that short exercise was powerful for people, I think speaks to the fact that we don't create time for reflection. In fact, there was a study, I'm forgetting what publication it was in, but there was a study that looked at a whole range of leadership development programs to see what were the aspects that made leadership programs successful or not. And what they found, the top 3 components were: number one, it had to focus holistically on the whole person of the leader, not just what they were doing in business, but the whole, physical, mental, emotional, spiritual components of leadership and being human. The second one was programs had to make enough time for reflection and meaning making in order to be effective. And to me, that speaks to exactly what we're talking about is you have to have, it can't just be all education and figuring out how to do
Hmm.
strategic thinking. Those are important, but leaders need to take for themselves and give to their teams time to think about these things. And the last one was, it has to be continuous, right? Which is part of what I do as a coach. Like it has to be more than a one-time workshop where we talk about these things. This is a process that happens over time. So to me, those are really the cores. The last thing that I would add, I think, for leaders who are wanting to cultivate a deeper sense of meaning for others in the workplace is taking a coaching approach, right? Asking rather than telling, trusting that people have their own answers, and being a supportive leader rather than telling people what to do or starting with your own perspective, but asking what's important to you, even if you're talking about career development or what they want to focus on, being able to balance. Yes, of course, there are things the company needs and that you need from them, but bringing that coaching approach so that they can really grow into who they are and who they want to be as a human being and as a professional, I think is really important.
Awesome. Awesome. So there you have it. Okay. Now, one other thing, Nick, is are there any key takeaways or insights that from the discussion that we've had today that you'd like my listeners to take away from this podcast?
Yeah, I think the key takeaways for me, I think, is that spirituality means something different to everybody. So again, I define it as whatever's most deeply meaningful for you. And so if you want to cultivate spiritual intelligence or a deeper sense of meaning, the more that you can spend time in reflection, paying attention to intuition on whatever is meaningful to you, that's a great place to start, right? You certainly can join programs, read books, be part of a spiritual path, but you don't have to, right? If you can start by spending time in reflection on what's meaningful to you and then paying attention to your intuition, I think that's an excellent start for anyone who's wanted to continue down this road. I think from a professional perspective, I think coaching is an amazing tool. I wouldn't be a coach if I didn't think it was valuable. So people who are wanting to incorporate these concepts or develop spiritual intelligence, I think certainly finding a coach, whether it's a professional coach like myself or a peer that can coach you, or a manager or a friend that you can have those conversations with. I think having a place where you can have those conversations can help people develop. And I think that the last thing that I would say is there's no right way to do any of this, right? If one of your goals is to cultivate spiritual intelligence for yourself or others, to make work more meaningful, start where you can and keep at it, right? It really is a lifelong process, and you often don't realize how significant of an impact you're having in the moment. So wherever it feels right for you, start there, keep going, and trust that you are making a difference.
Awesome. I couldn't have given better advice than that. So I want to express my sincere gratitude to you, Nick, for joining us today. And peace be with you, with your family. And I'm sure we're going to have future conversations moving forward. Take care.
Absolutely. Thank you.
We really hope you enjoyed this episode of Spiritually Speaking with Dr. Kwaisi Asar. This concludes our thought-provoking discussion on topics related to spirituality. Stay connected to us by subscribing to this podcast and show your appreciation by sharing our message with others. Until next time, be kind to yourself and to each other.